Tonight we're talking about one of the strangest choices the ancient Romans ever made. Perfume made from fermented fish guts. Imagine strolling through a bustling Roman street, marble columns gleaming, vendors shouting, and suddenly you catch a whiff of something that makes you pause. It's not the aroma of roses, not incense wafting from a temple, but something sharp, salty, almost oceanic, and it's clinging to the tunic of the wealthy patrician strutting past you. Yes, people in Rome sometimes dabbed themselves with concoctions so pungent that if you wore it today, you probably wouldn't survive a crowded subway ride. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in ancient Rome, where the air is a cocktail of aromas. There's fresh bread baking in clay ovens, smoke curling from sacrifices on temple altars, and sewage trickling through stone channels that don't always keep the smell contained. Amid all this, perfumes aren't a luxury, they're a survival strategy. Romans lived in a world of strong smells, so masking, softening, or even overpowering them became part of daily life. Perfume, in their eyes, wasn't frivolous, it was practical, social, and sometimes even medical. But here's the twist. While some citizens doused themselves in blends of saffron, cinnamon, and imported roses, others reached for something shockingly earthy. Fermented fish guts. The very same foundation for garum, Rome's most beloved condiment. Think of garum as the ketchup of the Roman Empire, only instead of tomatoes, it was made from layers of fish entrails left to rot under the sun. Delicious, right? Except in some recipes, that very mixture was strained, refined, and reborn not as food, but as fragrance. Picture yourself in a Roman villa, stepping across cool mosaic floors into the atrium. A servant brings out a small alabaster flask, its stopper sealed with wax. The lady of the house tilts it open and a wave of pungent air escapes. To modern noses, it might smell like someone left tuna salad in the sun, but to hers, it's exotic, a mark of wealth. Perfume wasn't just about sweetness, it was about standing out. If everyone else wore rosewater, the bolder elite might choose something stronger, something that left no doubt when they entered a room. The mainstream historical fact is this: the Romans were obsessed with perfumes. Pliny the Elder, in his endless catalogue of natural wonders, listed dozens of recipes and ingredients, from saffron blossoms to myrrh imported from Arabia. Some of these scents cost fortunes. Emperors were known to spend whole estates' worth on securing shipments of rare resins and oils. But tucked in the records, just faintly, are references to stranger brews, garum being strained, altered, and used not just for flavor but for fragrance. The quirky tidbit here is that Roman satire loved to poke fun at this. Writers like Martial and Juvenal jabbed at wealthy citizens who stank of perfumes so strong they made others gag. Historians still argue whether some of these fishy perfumes were actual fashion or simply biting jokes, exaggerations meant to mock the elite. Either way, the imagery is too good to ignore. A senator rising to speak in the forum, and instead of smelling like roses, he reeks of last night's fish market. As you trail him down the marble steps, you might catch another whiff of just how complicated Roman perfumery was. Oils were the base, usually olive or almond. Into that, makers stirred powders, herbs, and resins. And yes, in certain corners, fermented fish guts. Maybe it was an experimental fad, maybe it was fringe medicine, or maybe it was satire come to life. Either way, it leaves you wondering if Roman dinner parties smelled more like feasts or fish stalls. There's something almost comforting about realizing humans have always chased strange trends. Today it's pumpkin spice everything or overpriced artisan water. Back then, it was perfumes that could double as salad dressing. And just as you settle into this thought, the scene blurs, because tomorrow in Rome, you're going to see just how central perfumes were to every part of life, fishy or not. You shuffle deeper into Rome, and the world of smell only intensifies. Perfume here isn't confined to boudoirs or temples, it's woven into almost every moment of daily life. Imagine you wake in a Roman domus, light filtering through a high atrium, and the first thing you do after stretching is reach for a vial of scented oil. You rub it into your skin, not because you're trying to seduce anyone at breakfast, but because it's simply how you start the day. In a city where sanitation struggles against heat and humanity, a dab of perfume is less about luxury and more about survival. Perfumes drift through banquets like silent guests. Reclining on couches, you'd feel servants moving behind you, sprinkling the air with scents to keep the roasted boar and honey cakes from being overwhelmed by the stink of sweat. Guests didn't just eat, they inhaled a whole sensory performance. Aromas were carefully orchestrated to mingle with wine, music, and conversation. Some hosts went so far as to scent the very cushions with oils, so when you shifted your weight, a little puff of fragrance rose up to tickle your nose. Forget party favors, Romans wanted you to carry home a whiff of their extravagance in your hair and clothes. The bathhouses, too, were epicenters of perfume culture. Picture yourself stepping into the steamy frigidarium, water echoing in marble pools. After the scrubbing, scraping, and soaking, attendants line up with jars of oils. Some are infused with saffron, others with cinnamon, and occasionally, something more experimental. Everyone is slicked, rubbed, and massaged with scents before leaving, so the streets outside thrum with perfumed bodies. To go UN-oiled would have been like showing up today without deodorant, socially risky, and sure to draw side-eye from strangers. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Romans spent staggering amounts on perfume. Pliny noted that the annual imports of certain resins and aromatics rivaled the empire's military expenses. To be perfumed wasn't optional if you were elite, it was part of your identity. To smell fragrant was to signal refinement, wealth, and participation in a global trade network that stretched from Spain to India. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Romans perfumed their pets. Little lapdogs, favored by aristocratic ladies, sometimes trotted around the house smelling faintly of saffron or myrrh. Even horses could be rubbed with scented oils before a triumphal parade. Imagine an entire cavalry clattering past, each horse smelling like the cosmetics counter at a mall. And here's where historians still argue, did everyone truly embrace perfumes with equal enthusiasm? Or was this mostly a fad of the rich? Archaeological finds of small glass perfume bottles suggest wide use, but satire and grumbling letters hint that plenty of common Romans despised the overwhelming clouds of scent. Some scholars think ordinary folks couldn't afford perfumes regularly, while others argue cheap local versions, herb-based, or yes, fish-based, meant that almost anyone could dab on something aromatic if they wanted to. So as you wander through Rome, you notice that perfume isn't just about smelling nice. It's about building identity. The soldier rubs on a sharp, resinous oil to project toughness. The merchant douses himself with cinnamon-scented blends to flaunt his trade connections. The senator practically marinates in exotic fragrances to broadcast his importance. And the ordinary citizen? Maybe they grab whatever they can afford, even if it smells a bit fishy. You catch yourself smiling at the sheer theatricality of it. Romans weren't just living their lives, they were staging them, using scent as a prop. And whether it was roses, saffron, or something dredged from the bottom of a fish barrel, perfume was the invisible costume everyone wore. You can almost hear the city sigh, a collective exhale of aromas, drifting and blending under the Mediterranean sun. You pause in the shade of a narrow Roman alley, and for the first time you get to see how these strange perfumes are actually made. It's not in a marble hall or a perfumed atrium, it's in a workshop that looks suspiciously like a fishmonger's backroom. Clay jars line the walls, their lids sealed with wax, and the air has that unmistakable tang, the smell of rotting fish that clings to your nostrils even when you try to breathe through your mouth. A perfumer, sleeves rolled up, stirs the contents of a jar with a long wooden paddle. He's not embarrassed, this is his art. The jar is full of fish guts, left to ferment under the sun until they've transformed into a rich, salty sludge. On another table, sprigs of rosemary, handfuls of crushed herbs, and vials of olive oil wait their turn. The perfumer explains, almost proudly, that the fish innards provide the base note, something strong and enduring, while the herbs and oils soften the edge. It's the Roman equivalent of blending a cologne, the pungent bottom layer balanced by something floral or spicy on top. Your stomach turns, but you can't look away. Romans knew fish could be transformed into more than food. Garum, the beloved condiment of the empire, was created almost the same way, layers of fish parts, left to rot, then strained and bottled. The difference here is intent. Instead of seasoning a stew, this concoction is meant for the human body. Imagine dabbing this behind your ears before a date. Smooth move, or perhaps just a very lonely one. Here's your mainstream historical fact: Roman perfumers were skilled chemists. They didn't just mash herbs together. They experimented with distillation techniques, mixing fixatives like resin and honey to make the scents last longer. Recipes traveled along trade routes, with influences from Egypt, Greece, and Persia shaping what ended up in Roman flasks. Some perfumes were so enduring that archaeologists have opened sealed bottles 2,000 years later and still caught a faint whiff. Now for the quirky tidbit: a few recipes for fish-based perfumes survive in fragmentary texts. They describe straining the liquefied guts, then adding crushed roses, saffron, or even honey to brighten the aroma. In other words, if your perfume smelled like fish market leftovers, just throw in a little honey and call it luxury. Historians still argue whether these fishy brews were truly worn as perfume or simply exaggerated tales used by satirists to mock the rich. One camp insists that Rome's perfume industry was too sophisticated to waste time on fish. The other points out that humans have always been willing to pay for eccentricity, so why not? After all, centuries later, people in medieval Europe dabbed civet musk, scraped from cat glands, on their necks and called it charming. Fish guts suddenly don't sound so wild. Back in the workshop, the perfumer pours the mixture into delicate alabaster flasks. He seals them with wax, then lines them up in a neat row. Buyers will come by tomorrow, choosing carefully depending on their taste or maybe their courage. A senator might buy the strongest batch, hoping to shock rivals at the forum. A courtesan might pick one sweetened with saffron, hoping its complexity makes her stand out. You watch as the perfumer wipes his hands on a rag, unconcerned that his skin now smells like he's been wrestling eels. As you step back into the sunlight, you can't help chuckling. Imagine a Roman teenager sneaking into their parents' flask, dabbing a bit before heading out, only to be told they smell like last week's market stall. Fashion, you realize, has always been ridiculous, and history is full of trends that make no sense until you look at them through the sleepy haze of time. You shuffle toward the harbor district, where ships unload amphorae stacked high with salty treasure. This is where Rome's most famous product, garum, rules. On the surface, it's just a sauce, a liquid squeezed from barrels of fermenting fish guts, beloved by everyone from soldiers to emperors. But tonight you begin to notice how garum's story seeps into more than food. Some jars don't head to kitchens. Instead, they vanish into workshops where scent makers tweak the recipe, pushing it from condiment to cologne. Imagine dipping bread into what looks like soy sauce, sharp and salty, only to learn later that some people smeared a cousin of it onto their skin. Your eyebrows rise. Rome is the empire of excess, after all, where nothing is wasted and everything can be repurposed. To them, garum wasn't just seasoning, it was a substance with prestige. To own the best batch, imported from Spain or North Africa, was like bragging about having a vintage wine collection today. The mainstream historical fact here: garum was so essential that entire coastal towns revolved around its production. Factories in Baetica, modern-day southern Spain, exported amphorae across the empire. The smell of these factories was so strong that towns built them downwind, so citizens wouldn't constantly feel like they were living inside a giant sardine can. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some sources describe a special variety called garum sociorum, prized for its clarity and gentler taste. But alongside these elite sources were stranger versions, thicker and funkier, which may have doubled as medicinal salves and perfumes. Think of it as extra strength garum, perfect for flavoring beans, or, if you were bold, dabbing on your neck. Historians still argue whether Romans really treated garum as perfume or if later writers exaggerated. One theory is that garum was applied to the skin in diluted forms, mixed with oils, because it was believed to have antiseptic properties. Another insists that references to fish-scented perfume were purely satirical digs at the wealthy. Either way, the overlap between source and scent is impossible to ignore. You wander through a market where flasks of perfume sit beside jars of garum, and you can't help but chuckle. What if the merchant mixed them up? "Here, madam, a flask of the finest Iberian garum," he says, and she takes it home, ready to dab it on before a dinner party. Suddenly, every guest is sneezing and reaching for more wine, pretending to be impressed while secretly hoping a breeze blows the smell away. Rome thrived on blurring lines between indulgence and absurdity. What you ate, what you wore, and even what you smelled like became performance. The fact that fish guts could migrate from the dinner table to the perfume tray only proves how creative or desperate Romans were in their pursuit of standing out. As the harbor quiets and amphorae are stacked like sleepy soldiers, you realize that to the Romans, garum was never just a source. It was identity, wealth, medicine, and maybe, just maybe, the boldest perfume fad history ever recorded. You wander into the beating heart of Rome's markets, and suddenly your senses are ambushed. The square is a living kaleidoscope of smells. Vendors shout as they slice cheese, spill honey, fry fritters, and roast chestnuts. Donkeys shuffle past, leaving behind their own unmistakable contributions to the atmosphere. And weaving through it all is the perfume trade, tiny stalls lined with colorful glass bottles, clay jars, and trays of dried herbs. Here, fragrance is spectacle. You lean over one counter where a merchant sprinkles rose petals into oil, letting them soak until the liquid blushes pink. At another, you watch a boy grind cinnamon sticks into dust, his hands and hair already carrying the spice. But tucked between these stalls, like a joke only the brave can stomach, sit flasks of fish-based perfume. They don't advertise it loudly, probably to avoid scaring customers off, but if you linger, you hear whispers, for those who desire a sharper aroma. The mainstream historical fact: Roman markets weren't just about food or pottery, they were international hubs of trade. Perfumes arrived from Arabia, India, and Egypt, carried across deserts and seas, fetching prices high enough to bankrupt a careless buyer. Some perfumes were so precious they were locked away, only brought out for special occasions like weddings or imperial banquets. Now for the quirky tidbit: perfumers sometimes staged little demonstrations in the markets. They'd dab oils on small birds or cloths, then wave them through the air like magicians performing tricks. One satirist even joked about perfumed pigeons fluttering around Rome, scattering fragrance over the crowd. It's not hard to imagine someone doing the same with a fishy concoction, sending the audience into half delight, half disgust. Historians still argue whether perfumes were considered art or mere commerce. Some evidence suggests perfumers belonged to guilds, their recipes guarded like family secrets. Others believe anyone with a jar, some oil, and a bold imagination could dabble in perfumery, which might explain how fermented fish guts snuck into the catalogue. As you shuffle between stalls, you notice how smells collide. The sweet drift of honey clashes with the tang of vinegar. Roses mingle with the salty edge of fish perfume. A woman nearby spritzes herself with saffron-scented oil, only to have a gust of wind carry the odor of fried mackerel across her face. She wrinkles her nose, and you can't help but smirk. It's the eternal market problem, the chaos of too many smells at once. And yet, there's beauty here. Rome's markets are theaters of the nose, each stall a stage, each scent an actor. Whether floral, spicy, or fishy, perfumes compete for attention in the same way gladiators competed for cheers. Some scents are beloved, others mocked, but all of them form the backdrop of Roman life. And as you drift onward, you realize you've been perfumed just by standing here, your tunic now carrying a little garlic, a little rose, and yes, perhaps a faint whisper of fish. You drift away from the market chaos and find yourself near the Senate, where marble columns throw long shadows across the forum. Here the air smells different, not of frying fritters or roasting nuts, but of ambition, sweat, and something deliberately layered on top. Senators and officials glide past, their togas swishing, and as they pass, you catch waves of perfume. Some are sweet with saffron and roses, others sharp with resin and cinnamon, and one or two unmistakably fishy. In Rome, perfume wasn't just a personal choice, it was politics. To smell distinct was to stand out, to carve a space in the endless competition for status. If you smelled like roses, you declared refinement. If you smelled like frankincense, you hinted at wealth from the east. But if you smelled of fish guts, well, that was either a bold eccentricity or a daring joke only the rich could afford to make. Here's the mainstream historical fact: emperors used perfumes as political theater. Suetonius, the biographer of emperors, described how Nero once doused an entire arena in scented water during a festival. Imagine sitting at a gladiator show, only for a mist of rosewater to rain down over the crowd. Perfume was spectacle, an empire flexing its wealth, drop by perfumed drop. The quirky tidbit: some senators supposedly rubbed perfume on their sandals so every step left a faint aroma trailing behind. Picture a room full of men in stiff togas, pretending to be serious about grain prices while their feet smell like a spice rack, or worse, like salted anchovies. That's one way to leave a mark on history. Historians still argue whether unusual perfumes, like those based on fish guts, were ever truly symbols of power. Some think they were satirical inventions meant to lampoon extravagant senators. Others suggest that in a culture obsessed with individuality, even bizarre scents became tools of self-promotion. After all, the louder or smellier you were, the harder you were to ignore. As you walk past the Curia Julia, you picture a debate inside. One senator rises, voice booming, toga perfect, but the chamber fills with the unmistakable tang of fermented fish. His rivals frown, not sure whether to laugh, gag, or applaud his confidence. You can't help but chuckle. Politics, then as now, is partly about theatre. Some wield speeches, some wield money, and some apparently wield ode of fish guts. Rome thrived on performance. Even the way someone smelled could be calculated, intentional, and manipulative. And as you drift through the forum, past statues and gossiping orators, you realize that power here isn't just spoken or carved in marble, it's worn in scent, wafting through the air, whether sweet, spicy, or suspiciously like last night's catch. You leave the solemn air of the forum and wander toward the Thermae, Rome's grand public bathhouses. Here, the story of smell takes on a whole new layer. From the outside, you hear the hum of voices and the splash of water echoing through vaulted halls. Inside, the air hits you like a wall, steam rising off hot pools, the tang of minerals, the faint mildew of damp stone, and above it all, the swirl of perfumes. Bathhouses weren't just places to scrub away grime. They were the heartbeat of Roman social life, equal parts spa, gym, and gossip hub. After sweating in the caldarium, scraping oil and dirt from your skin with a strigil, and plunging into the cold frigidarium, you emerged slick and bare, ready for the finishing touch, the oiling. Attendants lined the rooms with jars of scented blends, ready to rub them into skin. Some oils were floral, others spicy, and occasionally one had that faintly fishy undertone. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Pliny the Elder noted that perfume oils were often stored in alabaster or glass containers because metal or clay could alter their scent. These delicate flasks became status symbols of their own, displayed like jewelry. To bring your own flask to the baths signaled wealth, much as someone today might flaunt a designer fragrance bottle. The quirky tidbit. Some bathhouses scented the very walls. Archaeologists have found traces suggesting that oils and perfumes were rubbed into plaster or mixed with paint, releasing fragrance when warmed by steam. Imagine leaning back against a marble bench and realizing even the architecture smells perfumed, though depending on the recipe, it might feel more like you're napping in a fish market sauna. Historians still argue whether fishgut perfumes were ever welcomed in communal spaces like the baths. One theory is that their strong, salty tang was used in medicinal contexts, believed to cure skin conditions or keep illness at bay. Another camp insists no one would have dared risk offending fellow bathers with something so pungent. And yet, the Romans had a high tolerance for bold scents, so maybe someone somewhere left the caldarium smelling faintly like fried sardines. You recline on a bench, listening to men debate politics while being massaged with perfumed oil. On one side, someone boasts of their saffron blend, on the other, a merchant shrugs and swears by his cheap fish-based concoction. The air is a chaotic cloud of smells, and you can't help laughing softly. Here, everyone is equal under the steam, no matter how ridiculous they smell. The bathhouse teaches you that for Romans, perfume wasn't optional. It was the final step of cleansing, the exclamation mark at the end of a ritual. And whether it was roses, myrrh, or fish guts, it was the scent you carried back into the city, trailing behind you as proof that you had bathed, gossiped, and belonged. You step back out into the sunlit streets, skin still slick from the imaginary oils of the bathhouse, and notice something subtle but powerful. Scent is status. In Rome, how you smell tells people exactly where you stand in society. The wealthy practically marinate in layers of perfumes, each note declaring, "I can afford this." The poor, meanwhile, might scrape together enough for a dab of cheap oil or simply let the natural aroma of hard work do the talking. Perfume becomes another piece of fashion. Just as togas differ in fabric and color to mark rank, so too does the intensity of scent. Some elites blend multiple fragrances, wearing roses over cinnamon over myrrh until they enter a room like a one-person spice market. Others go even further, deliberately choosing the oddest or strongest smells to stand out, perhaps even the sharp tang of fermented fish guts. Imagine a patrician lady sweeping into a banquet hall, trailing a scent that makes half the room swoon and the other half gag. Here's the mainstream historical fact: Roman satirists loved mocking this excess. Martial joked that wealthy citizens reeked of perfumes so overpowering they could choke a passerby. He wasn't just making fun of their noses, he was poking at the absurdity of wealth flaunted through smell. And here's the quirky tidbit: there are stories of people scenting not just themselves but their clothing, their wigs, even their couches. One wealthy man supposedly drenched his banquet cushions in saffron, so guests who sat down would carry the smell home with them. If saffron could cling to your tunic, why not fish guts? The thought makes you chuckle. Party favors, Roman style. Historians still argue whether over-perfuming was admired or ridiculed. Some scholars suggest the elite proudly displayed their ability to drown in fragrance. Others argue the average Roman found it ridiculous, and satire wasn't far off the mark. Was smelling like a bouquet or a fishmonger's stall a sign of refinement or just bad manners? The debate lingers, like a stubborn whiff of perfume on a hot day. As you walk past a row of shops, a group of young men pass by, their tunics freshly scented, laughing loudly as though their fragrance alone makes them untouchable. Behind them, an old vendor mutters, shaking her head, probably thinking they smell more like overripe olives than roses. And you realize status in Rome wasn't just about gold, marble, or eloquence. It was about how you carried yourself through the air. You drift into a quieter courtyard, where the usual bustle of Rome is softened by whispers and stolen glances. Here the air smells different, not of politics or markets, but of desire. Lovers slip through porticos, servants carry trays of wine, and in the corners you notice small flasks of perfume, ready for the evening's experiments. Among them are the usual suspects: rosewater, saffron oil, myrrh, but tucked in the shadows, you see a vessel that looks suspiciously like it came from a fishmonger's stall. In Rome, perfume wasn't just for banquets or baths. It was weaponized in romance. Aphrodisiac recipes promised to set hearts racing, and sometimes the stranger the smell, the more powerful it was believed to be. A concoction made from fermented fish guts might have been mixed with honey, herbs, or even wine, then dabbed on the skin with the hope of igniting passion. To us, the idea sounds disastrous, like trying to woo someone while smelling of low tide, but to a Roman, unusual scents could signal intensity, boldness, even magic. Here's the mainstream historical fact: love potions and perfumes often overlapped in antiquity. Ovid wrote cheeky lines about using fragrance to entice lovers, and Roman households kept books of recipes blending perfumes with herbs like fennel, coriander, and even onions. The belief was simple: the nose leads the heart. The quirky tidbit: some texts suggest fish-based perfumes were thought to enhance fertility. The logic seems slippery: fish produce many offspring, so why not borrow their essence? Imagine a nervous young bride dabbing herself with fish-scented oil, convinced it would help her start a family. Her poor groom, meanwhile, is probably wondering why their wedding night smells like the docks at Ostia. Historians still argue whether these aphrodisiac perfumes were genuinely used or simply joked about in literature. Some think they were ritualistic, more symbolic than practical. Others insist the Romans, ever curious and experimental, would have tried anything once, even if it left their partners wrinkling their noses. As you stand in the courtyard, you picture a scene. A lover arrives with a flask of fishy perfume, claiming it will ensure eternal devotion. The other nods politely, accepts the dab on the wrist, and then quickly orders more wine to cover the smell. It's ridiculous and oddly tender at the same time. Because really, hasn't love always involved questionable decisions? You wander next to a temple complex, where the scent of burning incense mingles with the heavy tang of animal sacrifices. Here, fragrance takes on a sacred dimension. Perfume, even the odd, fishy varieties, isn't just about personal appeal or social display, it's woven into ritual, offerings, and funerary practices. As you tiptoe past columns carved with gods' faces, you see priests carefully pouring oils into small bowls, letting the smoke rise in deliberate curls. Romans believed scent could bridge the human and divine. Flowers, myrrh, and resins were common, but some records hint that even garum-based oils occasionally made it into ritual use. Imagine offering a blend of honey and fermented fish guts to a god in the hope of securing favor. It might make you cringe today, but the act was symbolic. Intense, enduring fragrances were thought to capture attention, literally and spiritually. The mainstream historical fact: perfumes were integral to Roman religious life. Temples often stored exotic oils and resins specifically for rituals, while burial sites sometimes contained small flasks meant to preserve the body's aroma or comfort the spirit. Scents weren't incidental, they were essential to ceremony. The quirky tidbit: some aristocrats reportedly scented their funeral pyres or tombs with oils that included pungent fish extracts. The logic was a little more practical than spiritual. Strong smells helped mask decay, but it also gave the departed a final signature, a way to leave a lasting impression, olfactory or otherwise. Historians still argue whether these extreme perfumes were truly ritualistic or simply exaggerations. Archaeological finds provide clues but not full explanations, leaving room for speculation. Did Romans see fish gut oils as sacred, or were they an eccentric nod to abundance and preservation? The debate is deliciously unresolved. As you move through the sacred spaces, you notice that perfume follows every step. Even as worshippers bow or carry offerings, the scent lingers: flowers, incense, and the faint, salty undercurrent of experimentation. It's a reminder that in Rome, fragrance was never simple. It was woven into life and death, play and piety, love and politics, a constant companion in every action. For a moment, you close your eyes, imagining the city as a single, breathing organism, scented in layers of rose, myrrh, honey, and yes, the occasional daring fish concoction. It is chaotic, confusing, intoxicating, and unmistakably Roman. You meander into a quieter street, where the faint hum of the city mingles with the smell of herbs drying in windowsills. Here, you notice Roman physicians setting up small stalls, jars lined neatly before them, each labeled with a scribbled name or a faintly hopeful claim. Perfume in this context isn't indulgence, it's medicine. They mix oils, resins, and sometimes fermented fish extracts, claiming cures for headaches, skin ailments, and even to ward off miasma, the foul air thought to spread disease. To the Romans, scent wasn't just about looking or smelling good, it could protect, heal, or enhance vitality. You watch as a patient receives a dab of garum-infused oil behind the ears. The physician swears it will clear sinuses and soothe nerves. You wrinkle your nose at the smell but nod politely, because this was serious business, the closest thing to a pharmaceutical aisle in the heart of Rome. Here's the mainstream historical fact: Roman medicine often relied on aromatic substances. Galen, the empire's most famous physician, recommended fragrant oils and balms for therapeutic purposes, believing certain smells could influence humors and temperaments. Treatments were part chemistry, part psychology, and part theater, because if you smelled like a medicinal concoction, everyone around you knew you were cared for. Now for the quirky tidbit: some perfumed medicines doubled as status symbols. A patient who could afford oils infused with saffron, myrrh, or exotic garum was signaling wealth and refinement, even while supposedly treating a cold. There are tales of noble Romans proudly displaying the tiniest flasks, like modern collectors flaunting vintage skincare. Historians still argue how widespread the use of fish-based medicinal perfumes really was. Some think references in texts exaggerate or satirize the elite's eccentric habits. Others argue that if ordinary Romans could scrape together a small portion of garum oil, they would use it both for health and vanity. Either way, the overlap between medicine and perfume is undeniable and a little baffling by modern standards. As you leave the physician's stall, you notice how pervasive scent is. The streets carry everything from baking bread to rotting fish, yet Romans navigate it with confidence, layering perfumes as armor. And you realize that in this city, whether for vanity, love, or health, a little or a lot of pungent aroma is never wasted. You step into the theater district, where laughter, shouting, and applause bounce off stone walls. Here, perfume has become a social weapon and occasionally, a source of rebellion. Writers and playwrights loved to poke fun at the overwhelming use of scent. You can almost hear the exaggerated complaints: "I can't hear the actors over the smell of your oils." The air is a mix of rosewater, spiced oils, and the faint, salty tang of fermented fish, and somewhere among the audience, someone is quietly gagging. Satirists like Juvenal and Martial wrote scathing verses mocking citizens who doused themselves in perfume to display wealth. One describes a man entering a theater, and instead of applause, the crowd recoils from the sheer strength of his aroma. The joke lands because, for all its sophistication, Roman olfactory culture could be overdone. Perfume was meant to charm, not assault. But excess was easy when the goal was to flaunt your fortune. The mainstream historical fact: satire was a recognized form of social commentary in Rome. Writers targeted everything from politics to fashion, and the overuse of perfumes became shorthand for vanity and pretension. Satirical verses were widely read, shared, and sometimes even recited aloud in public spaces. The quirky tidbit. Some Romans reportedly staged perfume battles during festivals, spraying oils on each other to see who could dominate the scentscape. Imagine a crowd of citizens wading through clouds of saffron, rose, and yes, fishgut perfume, cheering as one smell emerges victorious. It sounds chaotic, but it also highlights how seriously, or playfully, the Romans took fragrance. Historians still argue whether these literary complaints reflect everyday life or exaggerated scenarios. Did ordinary Romans truly endure streets filled with overpowering scents, or were these just satirical exaggerations targeting the wealthy? Archaeological evidence is limited, leaving us to piece together the olfactory culture from texts and remnants of perfume flasks. You walk past the theater, taking in the lingering aroma of oils, sweat, and bread from nearby stalls. It's a sensory overload, but one that tells a story. Romans were obsessed with how they and others smelled. Perfume could elevate you socially, provoke satire, or even inspire laughter. And somewhere in the middle of it all, that faint hint of fermented fish lurks, an olfactory reminder that eccentricity was always in fashion. You drift out of the theater district and along the quieter backstreets of Rome, noticing how the scents of the city evolve. Here, the everyday collides with the exotic. Merchants return from far-flung corners of the empire, bringing with them new ingredients, curious oils, and occasionally, the faint echo of fishgut perfumes that survived the journey across seas and deserts. It's a reminder that Rome's obsession with aroma didn't fade with the setting sun, it spread across centuries and borders. The mainstream historical fact: Roman trade networks were vast. Spices from India, resins from Arabia, and rare oils from Egypt found their way into city markets and villas alike. Perfumes weren't just indulgence, they were part of a complex global economy. Certain blends, once exclusive to the elite, trickled down to more ordinary citizens over time, influencing scent culture long after the initial imports. Now for the quirky tidbit. Sailors and travelers reportedly carried small flasks of potent perfume, including the occasional garum variant, to ensure they retained a sense of Roman luxury while at sea. Imagine a ship's cabin, cramped and humid, with scents battling the natural odors of salt, fish, and cramped human quarters. One can only wonder how many sailors emerged smelling like roses, or a floating fish market. Historians still argue how much influence these Roman aromatic experiments had on later centuries. Some suggest medieval apothecaries borrowed directly from Roman perfumery, while others think the connection is more thematic than literal. Either way, the legacy of bold, sometimes bizarre scents persisted, reminding us that experimentation and occasional eccentricity has always shaped culture. You stroll past a quiet fountain, sunlight glinting on water, thinking about the peculiar persistence of smell. Perfume, after all, isn't just ephemeral, it lingers in memory, in stories, in cultural echoes. Rome's love for scent, including its most daring creations, would ripple far beyond the city walls. And perhaps somewhere in the distant future, a curious perfumer would pick up a recipe from an old manuscript, mixing flowers with fermented fish, unwittingly continuing a tradition that began 2 millennia earlier. The city exhales around you, a symphony of fragrances both natural and manufactured. And somewhere in the mix, that daring, pungent Roman boldness, the willingness to experiment with smell, even when it confounds, reminds you why history, like perfume, leaves an unforgettable mark. You find yourself in a quiet study, surrounded by scrolls and oil lamps flickering in the evening light. Scholars murmur over texts, debating endlessly about Rome's eccentricities. And tonight, their focus is perfume, the good, the bad, and the fishy. Some insist that the elite truly wore garum-based blends, flaunting their wealth with daring scents. Others argue these stories are exaggerations, satire stretched over centuries, meant to amuse and criticize. The truth hovers somewhere in between, tantalizing and elusive. The mainstream historical fact: Roman literature is rife with references to extravagant perfumes, both ordinary and strange. Authors like Martial, Juvenal, and Pliny the Elder leave hints, cataloging ingredients, praising some blends, and mocking others. The texts show a culture fascinated with olfactory identity and social display. The quirky tidbit: a few surviving recipes suggest that fish-based oils were sometimes blended with precious resins, honey, and rose extracts, creating a scent that might have been tolerable, if not entirely pleasant, to the modern nose. This hints that Romans were experimenting in ways that straddled culinary, cosmetic, and even medicinal realms. Historians still argue whether these extreme scents were real fashion statements or literary exaggerations. Some maintain that they were part of elite eccentricity, a bold form of social signaling. Others insist that satire exaggerated the reach and popularity of fish-based perfumes, turning a rare experiment into legend. The debate is deliciously unresolved, letting your imagination wander through markets, baths, and villas, wondering just who truly wore these daring fragrances. You lean back in your imaginary chair, picturing Rome as a living canvas of scent. Perfume here isn't simply an accessory, it's power, politics, love, and memory bottled in tiny flasks. The fishy aromas, the roses, the resins all blur together in a city that thrived on sensory extremes. And somewhere in that mix, the daring boldness of experimentation lingers, a whisper of curiosity carried across centuries. In this quiet study, the debate continues, scholars leaning over texts and flasks, and you can almost feel the faint trace of ancient perfume lingering in the air, as if the past refuses to be fully tamed or explained. It's messy, it's bold, and it's unmistakably Roman. You drift back into the bustling streets one final time, Rome bathed in the warm glow of sunset. The city exhales in a symphony of scents: roasted chestnuts from market stalls, sweet floral oils from perfumers, the sharp tang of salted fish, and the faint echoes of garum-based perfumes daring enough to traverse centuries. As you wander, you notice how the layers mingle, overlapping like threads in a tapestry, each one telling a story of wealth, love, ambition, and experimentation. The mainstream historical fact: Romans regarded perfume as an essential part of daily life, signaling not only status but refinement, health, and even moral character. To walk through the streets, to recline in a bathhouse, or to attend a forum without scent was unthinkable for the elite. Fragrance marked identity, much as clothing or hairstyle did, and its careful use or misuse was observed, whispered about, and critiqued. The quirky tidbit: some Romans reportedly carried personal flasks of perfume so they could refresh themselves at any moment. One can imagine senators dabbling with small amounts of fishgut perfume before a debate, or lovers discreetly applying aphrodisiac blends while meeting under porticos. These small gestures, intimate yet public, show that fragrance wasn't just cosmetic, it was woven into everyday experience, sometimes daringly, sometimes humorously. Historians still argue how far the most unusual scents truly penetrated Roman life. Were fermented fish perfumes a fleeting fad of the daring elite, or a persistent, if niche, olfactory tradition? The records tease and tantalize, leaving us with tantalizing glimpses of what it might have smelled like to navigate the empire surrounded by these audacious aromas. As the sun sets, you feel the city's pulse slow. Perfumes, oils, and garum linger in memory, mingling with marble columns, bustling streets, and whispered conversations. The scents are no longer just smells, they are stories, histories, and human quirks preserved in imagination. You take a deep breath, carrying the essence of Rome with you, a blend of flowers, spice, and yes, fermented fish guts, all swirling into memory. Now, slowly, the city quiets, and you notice your own breathing syncing with the fading light. Picture the streets empty, the baths still, the markets closed, and the lingering perfume softening into a memory, like smoke dissolving into air. Feel the warmth of the marble fade beneath your fingertips, the echoes of voices soften, and imagine the faint scent of flowers and distant fish mingling in a gentle, playful swirl. Let the chaotic vibrancy of Rome dissolve into calm. Breathe deeply. Allow the aromas of history, once so intense, to soften and fade. The daring experiments, the eccentric displays, the laughter, gossip, and whispered love all settle into a gentle hum of memory. Let your thoughts drift through the arches and fountains one last time, imagining the city breathing slowly, its scents now subtle, almost comforting. Relax. The stories of audacious perfumes, bold citizens, and even the most pungent fish oils are behind you now. Rome continues its life in your mind, a place of curiosity, creativity, and subtle chaos, fading like a perfume worn just right.